Me.
Welcome everyone to Carleton Connects, the college's monthly webinar that connects you with new and engaging work being done on campus by faculty and staff and out in the world by alumni young and old. I'm Christopher Brunell in the Office of Alumni Relations, and I'm here in Carleton's Cowling Arboretum today with the Puzak Family Director of the Cowling Arboretum and distinguished member of the class of 1981, Nancy Breaker.
Hi, Christopher. So glad to have you out in the arb with me.
It's really great to have you here on the show.
And I wanted to give a special shout out to the class of 1981. I am so sorry we can't get together this June, but hopefully in the future. And then, of course, hi to all of my fellow Carls that I knew at Carleton and those of you that I have met since we all graduated and then when I've come back and met you during reunion. I just wanted to take a moment to say that we recognize the Metawakan and Wapakutute Dakota people on whose ancestral homelands we are walking on today. Shall we start?
Yeah, we're going to go on a tour here through part of the vast and glorious Arboretum here in the winter. Folks, some of you sent in some questions when you registered. Feel free to send in more comments and questions via the chat, and we'll see what we can do to get some of those answered as well. So I'll be walking, and Nancy will be walking, and we'll walk and talk and chew gum, perhaps, figuratively speaking, at the same time. We are here. Tell us where we are.
Right, so Christopher, I think you have the camera trained on the Cannon River, which is the feature that most people remember from the Arboretum, from either just walking past it or maybe fishing or canoeing as well, or maybe during senior week when there's a big tradition of rafting down the river between classes ending and graduation. And you can see it's not frozen. It typically doesn't freeze in the winter, except in the really cold winters. And I just wanted to quickly address a question that was sent in about whether or not we've been seeing more wildlife in the Arboretum in the past 20 years since we've started our restoration work. And there's many, many great conservation successes that I hope to tell you about today. But one of them actually has to do with the river. First of all, it is in better condition than it was 20, 40, 50 years ago, as there's more and more work to clean it up and make sure that septic is properly taken care of and so forth. And one of the things we've seen in just in the past couple years is the return of river otter to the Cannon. And we have mostly seen their tracks sliding down the snowy banks and across the ice into the river. We've seen the fish that they have pulled out of the river and left out on the ice. And then we have actually seen a couple otters themselves, although they're pretty secretive, but we've seen a lot of sign of them. And that's been just a really fun thing to have added to the local ecosystem.
That's great. Yeah. Thanks, Nancy.
It is.
So now we're going to walk a little bit along the edge of the river on one of the tracks that is not groomed for cross-country ski use. Although, Nancy, when we talk next, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the ways in which the arb is used during the winter and not just by river otters.
Yeah, so we have a lot of winter arb use, and partly because we have a great relationship with the Northfield High School cross-country ski team, and they use the Arboretum to practice. And in exchange, some of the parents of the ski team help us groom the trails. So we do have our own staff that groom trails, but we also have these community volunteers that help groom, and that has just made a really great experience for everybody. And then, of course, there's a lot of snowshoeing and just general walking. And even in the winter, there's still classes that are using the Arboretum. The introductory biology class comes out and collects gall-fly galls to do DNA sequencing. And these are animals that are active all winter and have live tissue that can be sampled. So we have a lot going on in the winter, Christopher.
That's great. We're going to walk here for a little while, folks, till we get to another good perspective. If you're just joining us, it's about 32 degrees here. It's a beautiful sunny day in Minnesota. Some of you in your comments when you registered mentioned that you hadn't been back on campus for 40 or 45 years, and that you hadn't been in the Arb for at least as long as well.
Another change that's taken place, which would be very clear if you were here, especially in the summer, but even now in the winter, is that a lot of the land that used to be in agriculture has been restored back, or is in the process of being restored back to more of a native state. And this area that we're looking at here that has kind of younger trees was certainly in agriculture when the class of 81 was here, and was not taken out of agriculture until 1990. So up until that point, it was in a rotation of corn and soybeans. And then it was taken out of agriculture. Some of it was just left to go through a natural process of reforestation. And in other places, there were trees that were planted. So there are quite a large part of the Arboretum that you would simply not recognize compared to what was here when you were a student. And at that time, the majority of what we now think of Arboretum was in agriculture. And now the majority of the Arboretum is in natural habitat, or in some phase of being restored to natural habitat. So it's been a really big change.
Thanks. Folks, the wind is picking up a little bit here. You may be able to hear it. Not gale force, but it's a brisk and sunny day here in the Arb. Nancy, how often do we get tree falls like the one that we have here?
We get quite a bit of tree fall activity. This one happens to be because of flooding of the river and the just the root mass of the tree being mostly eroded away, so the tree's fallen over. In this particular area, we also have a lot of beaver activity, and I'm sure that we will see some beaver chewing. Actually, right around this side of this tree that's partway down, there's a lot of beaver activity. But everywhere along the river, we see chewing and changing of the landscape because of those animals. Nature's engineers are busy at work.
Thanks.
This little footpath that we are walking on, some of you might remember, although it looks very different, used to be a maintained path along the river. And in about, I guess it's probably in the early 90s, it was abandoned. We no longer maintained it. And part of that is biggest reason for that was because there is a rare turtle that we have in the Arboretum, the wood turtle, which is threatened in Minnesota and throughout its range. And after some studies were done with radio telemetry, using a student to implement a study to understand where the turtles were using the Arb, it was discovered they spent a huge amount of time right here in this field. And that meant that trail maintenance, they were vulnerable to trail maintenance, being run over by a tractor, for example, and even just people encountering them along the trail. And they are commonly picked up and taken into captivity as pets. They're really beautiful turtles. And so by closing this trail, we were able to protect them from those kinds of activities. It's still open to use by people who want to be off the manicured trail, but we just don't maintain it, remove fallen trees, mow it, etc.
Sure. Nancy, we had someone write in and ask, are we walking upstream or are we walking downstream with the cannon?
Oh, it's a good question. We are walking downstream, following the cannon downstream.
Folks, we're I don't know if you can, how clearly you can see the cannon right here, but we've got the water moving left to right. So that's downstream, and that's the way we go. If we keep walking for, I don't know, about 30 or 40 hours, we could probably get to the Mississippi.
We would get to the Mississippi, right at Red Wing,
Yes.
just above Red Wing. We
It would take a little while, but
yes,
we could do that.
although I have talked to people who have canoed that whole stretch.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, that's marvelous. And, you know, for those of us who haven't made quite as much progress in our education with nature, and might be challenged to identify trees even when they have leaves on them, what kind of trees do we have here in the lower stretches of the Arb?
Sure. So in the background, if you swing your camera around that way, there's a little grove of what are silver maples. And that's the ones that are quite dense together, that's a very common floodplain forest tree. That we have some enormous ones that 3 people can barely get their arms around. And then we have a lot of young ones coming up. And then this one right here is a black walnut. And black walnuts are normally not considered a floodplain tree, but they do very well here, at least where it's not wet year round. And honestly, this is like the most walnutty place I have ever experienced. There's a huge amount of walnut growing here. And then we also have box elder is a very common tree to find in wetter areas. This one that looks almost dead and is kind of leaning over is a box elder. They're a much shorter lived species, but they tend to come in pretty early once areas are taken out of cultivation. Let's see, what else do we have? This one right here is a green ash, and we are going to be losing all of our green ash here because of the emerald ash borer, which is a invasive beetle species that attacks all species of ash and kills them. There's no resistance to them. And so we are looking at ways that we can introduce additional species to maintain good diversity in our forests. As we haven't started to lose ash yet, but we will probably in the next 10 years. So we need to start thinking about what we might be able to bring in that would do well. And that's brought up a lot of interesting conversation about a technique that's called assisted migration. Someone had a question about climate change and what kinds of things have I seen or are we thinking about in terms of our restoration. And one of the issues that we've been talking about is whether or not we want to deliberately bring in species that are currently not in range, but south of us, but our climate's going to change to a point where they will do very well here. So for example, one lowland tree species is sycamore, and we think that tree would do very well here. It's in Iowa, it's not in Minnesota, but it's not that far away. So that's a species we're thinking about introducing to our floodplain forests to help replace ash trees when they start to go, and also keep our forests more diverse.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. And so how, if we see a tree like this one, the green ash here, how old would this tree be?
This tree is probably between 30 and 50 years old.
Okay.
And then just behind it, there's another tree right on the riverbank, which is a hackberry. It has really knobby bark. And that is a very common tree in the Arboretum, both in the lowland areas and also in the forest.
Sure. Thanks. We're going to move on here for a little while.
One of the species that we've been battling in all habitat types in the Arboretum is bush honeysuckle. And Chris, you can show that big stump that was cut off a couple years ago. And we do have to use herbicide on most of these non-native shrubs that we're trying to remove. This one was treated, but the treatment was not as effective as we would have liked. We'll have to come back and do more treatment. But this is a species that the founder of the Arboretum, Harvey Stork, planted a lot of bush honeysuckle and other species that we would wish he would not have. I sort of have a love-hate relationship with Harvey Stork because he was brilliant to bring this concept of an arboretum to Carleton. But of course, in the 20s and 30s, no one was thinking about the problem that non-native species were going to create for us in the future.
Sure.
So he introduced several species of bush honeysuckle. He also introduced buckthorn. And Christopher, this stump here was from a buckthorn that was cut. They're often much bigger than that. Where we're walking right now is an area where we had a big contract with a outside company to do a large buckthorn and honeysuckle removal for us maybe about 5 years ago, and now we're continuing to follow up with ones that were too small for them to even notice, and ones where the herbicide treatment wasn't as good as we would have liked. So 5 years ago, we could not have walked through here because it was so dense with these invasive shrubs. And now we have a pretty nice open understory here. And as we continue to work on removing those non-natives, we'll be able to start planting, as I mentioned, some other trees to diversify the forest.
Great. Well, and despite the challenges 100 years ago of not necessarily being aware of all the complications of introducing non-native plants, there is at least part of the upper Arb that is named after him. There is the Stork Forest, isn't there?
Yes, that is a really interesting situation. So Harvey Stork and Stuzy, who I'm sure most of you will recognize that name, who was the groundskeeper at Carleton, in addition to having a lot of other roles, they, for reasons that we have not been able to determine, because Stork did not write anything down. I tell my students, write everything down. We want to know what you're doing. They went out and collected sapling trees and native wildflowers and created a really amazingly beautiful and rich forest with all native species almost in the Upper Arboretum. It's quite small. It's just a couple acres, but it is really one of the most beautiful parts of the Arboretum in the spring, so in April and May. And we think he was just trying to create a beautiful place for people to visit, but he really created one of the first, what we would call forest restoration. So, of course, at that time, restoration was not even a term that anyone used. People planted trees, they planted forests for timber production, but they were not thinking about restoring all the species that were there historically. And so even if he wasn't planning to do that, it is what he did, and it's really an amazing little patch of forest.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Yeah, there's so many different areas here in the Arb.
Christopher, here's a place where a beaver is getting really ambitious. They're to cut down the enormous hackberry tree. They sometimes do cut down trees that are that big, but mostly I call it recreational chewing. Just keeping occupied.
It's good to have a hobby if you're a beaver. You know, erosion is just it just means gnawing away. So that works for beavers, but it also works for riverbanks. Is there what should we know about the change in the sides of the river here?
Well, my friends that were geology majors that are on the call would be able to tell you much more about that than I can, but I will give it a crack. So erosion of riverbanks is fairly natural. Certainly sometimes there's a larger amount of erosion than you would like, especially when we see the flooding that is in larger amounts and at different times of the year than it was historically. But the river changes course all the time. It breaks down banks and overflows. It carries a lot of sediment up into the floodplain that nourishes those plants. And so erosion on its own is a natural phenomena that there's a couple of mallard ducks that just flew by, that we would expect to see. What we do want to guard against is excess erosion that happens when there's more water being put into the river from agricultural fields where they've been doing draining and putting more water into the river. And as I said, at different times, we have much more rain at different times of the year that causes flooding at times we wouldn't expect. So, but it's not unnatural to have bare riverbanks. That's important habitat for a lot of species.
Sure. And of course, is that the train tracks that we have on the other side
Yep,
of the river?
Yep, there's the Carleton land continues on the other side of the river and to the other side of the train tracks in most places.
Okay. Nancy, is this a particularly determined beaver or batch of beavers here?
Well, it could just be one or several. And in the winter, they feed on the bark of trees. So that's, they're both trying to get the tree down, but they're also eating the bark. And then twigs and buds. And normally in the winter, when there's more ice on the river and the beavers have made lodges, they also will cut branches and stick them underwater, and that's what they feed on in the winter. It's like having
kind of a reverse popsicle.
Yes, but it keeps the branches fresh and the bark green and useful to them. And so it's basically refrigerating it over winter, and then it's available to them. But when there's not a lot of snow, they can still come out of the river and feed on trees and
great.
twigs. There was a question about how students use the ARB today compared to historically, or in the past, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And one of the things that is increasing is the academic use of the Arboretum. Our students still use the Arboretum recreationally, for running, for walking, for visiting with their friends. They still sleep out overnight like I did often in the Arboretum. Running, our athletic teams do a lot of training in the Arboretum. But as part of my job as the director of the Arboretum, it's to facilitate more academic use. And so working with faculty and working with their students to just help them figure out how can they use the ARB, what can I do to help them, whether that's identifying materials for art students, granting them permission to gather materials that they might take back to the art studio, or actually create a art piece in the Arboretum. So we have a lot of art use. Our ceramics instructor has her students dig clay in the Arboretum. She works with the soils faculty to identify where they'll find soil with good clay content, and then they harvest that and use that in some of their classes. We had, I guess 2 years ago, we had a classics course that was looking at some of the materials that historically people use and were mentioned in various literature, and then creating pens out of feathers and carving handles out of bone and various things. So whatever I can do to help a faculty member, maybe I'm going out with their lab to give an introduction to a certain habitat. Maybe I'm doing something as simple as opening a gate so they can drive in with all the easels and stools that the painting students need. But I would say that that has been something that really in the past 10 to 15 years has increased, because now there's a staff person who's dedicated to making sure that that those kinds of things can happen.
That's really great to hear. And I know that there have also been archaeological projects here in the Arb.
Yes, we have a new archaeologist who has been using the Arb both for just learning techniques, how to walk through a field and look for material and map them, as well as actually having digs. So many of you are familiar with the Women's League cabin, which sadly is no longer there, but is now an archaeological site for our students. And then there's also Pine Hill Village, which was the site of housing for veterans coming back from World War II, veterans and their families. And then a site along the Cannon River where the Waterford Mill used to be. So those are all sites that the archaeologist has used for his class and for digs. So
Great.
That's been really a lot of fun to work with them.
Great, that's really good to hear. We're getting some live use now for bipeds and quadrupeds alike.
Here's one of those goldenrod golf balls I mentioned that the introductory biology class uses. This one has been eaten by a woodpecker. They know, a lot of fishermen know about these because they use the little grubs inside. It's a fly larvae for fishing bait. But any of them that are close enough to trees are vulnerable to being found by woodpeckers. So the ones down here in the floodplain don't make it very easily.
Be stepping over some more trees here.
You know that our manager is so untidy. This hasn't.
Yeah, Nancy, if you you seem to be doing other things with your days besides just cleaning up all these logs lying around. It's almost as if they're meant to be there.
I know that we have a couple people on the line who worked either on the ARB crew, summer or during the school year, and also some that were student naturalists, either with myself or with Miles Bakke in the past. And I just wanted to mention the Cole Student Naturalist Program that is going strong, and we've been increasing it in terms of the number of students involved. This is a program funded through the Cole Family Memorial Fund, and we train our students to about the natural history of the Arboretum and then how to interpret it to a broader audience, whether it's students or campus visitors or members of the Northfield community. So they write an article every week for the Carletonian, and we also post that on our website. So if you want to read their weekly ARB note, they're always really interesting. This one the one from last week was about the Christmas bird count and the many geese that we counted on the lakes in December. They also plan activities for other students to get them out in the ARB, help them feel more comfortable. When if we have youth groups that ask for an activity or a tour, they will serve in that capacity. So that's been just a really fulfilling program for me personally to oversee.
That's great. Yeah, and it's nice to be able to have people connected to the ARB for more than just a week or two, but throughout their time as students.
Right.
For those of you who remember that there's a great deal more to the ARB, we will be making our way in a bit up from the river bottoms here to parts of the lower ARB that have a rather different view. We'll get there soon enough.
Here's an entire tree that the beaver have taken down.
Nancy, you pointed out those two mallards that flew by a little while ago down the river. Do we get more birds that we might not know about here in the ARB in the winter?
Well, there's quite a few species that just live here year round. So downy and hairy woodpeckers, bald eagles nest here and spend the winter here since the river is not frozen. We get some things that come from farther north, juncos, sometimes snowy owls. If in particular years we will get a big influx of snowy owls. Sometimes we'll have saw-whet owls that we see. They're tiny little, like screech owls, tiny, the tiniest owl that we find sometimes in the winter. But far fewer species.
Sure.
Compared to, of course, nesting season and migration. One of the activities that we have in the spring is the spring bird count that we do every year. And I would say normally we would document between 60 and 90 species, kind of depending on if we have a really good birder with us, because they can hear things that and identify them that I can't even hear, as compared to the Christmas bird count where we identified 14 species.
Sure.
So, very different fauna depending on the time of year. In terms of birds, we do have a lot more grassland birds that utilize the ARB in the summer than we had during the agricultural phase of the Arboretum, because at that time there was really no habitat available for them unless there happened to be a patch of hayfield here and there or a pasture. And now that we have restored much of the agricultural land to prairie, we have a very robust grassland bird breeding population. So things like meadowlarks, a lot of killdeer, Every once in a while, we'll have a bobolink, although not too frequently. Henslow sparrow, Savannah sparrow, yellow throats. So quite a few grassland species that would not have been here in high numbers at all, and some not at all. So that has been a really exciting result of the grassland restoration.
Great. Yeah, that's really great. Those of you tuning in from home, we're still at around 32 degrees here. The wind has picked up a little bit. It's getting a little more overcast. In other words, it's a beautiful day of January in Minnesota, which is exactly where everyone wants to spend the winter. And again, I'm being helped by my colleague Krista Herbstreth back in the office. And one of the challenges of being out here in the Arb is that I can't look at my watch to see what time it is. Nancy, what time do we have? 2:42. Well, we've got about a little less than 20 minutes here. So we'll move along.
You know, another project I wanted to mention, Chris, does not have to do with anything out here on the ground, but has to do with a project I have been working on with the library to develop a digital archive for many, many documents about the Arboretum. And some of these, many of them are student papers, so things that not would have been published papers, but have interesting history about the Arb, maybe data that students collected. Also, planning documents, maps, photos, many things that would be otherwise very hard to find in one place. And we have created an electronic archive of these it's available through the library website. Right now, it's only available if you're on campus or if you log in with your Carleton credentials, which you can always retrieve from the college if you don't remember how to get in. But we're hoping to make that collection open to the broader public because we do get people who are interested in some of the work we've done in the Arboretum, would like to access some of that data. So we also have a project where we're reaching out to alumni whose items are either in the archive or that we'd like to include to get their permission to include those items in a public way.
Thanks. And Nancy, I'll let you know that Krista has just added the link to that set of documents to the chat. So folks, if you want to go look and see what has been collected, please do. You know, while we keep walking, Nancy, I'll say that one of my favorite elements of the lower Arb here is just how far down the river it goes, and ending up at the old iron bridge. And I think there may be people, if they haven't been back to Northfield for a while, it might be news to them that the bridge has been replaced and straightened out. And that has the Arb been increased in size in the last 20 years or so?
It has been, and actually with the bridge project, it reduced in size by about an acre because we donated some land to the township for building the new bridge. The old bridge is still there and is going to be a pedestrian and bike bridge eventually. But we also have acquired some additional land. The largest piece of about 75 acres was acquired in 2003, and that's in the lower Arb. And some of it has been now planted to prairie, and some is still rented back to the family that we purchased it from as part of the purchase agreement. And then there's been a tiny little piece that was acquired. It was actually on the other side of the river along the railroad. We did not know, we didn't own it. We've been using it forever. And sharp-eyed Nat Case, who is a art major and makes maps for us, noticed this, and we reached out to the landowner, who ended up just donating it to us. It was only like a 1/4 acre, but it was a very nice thing to get kind of straightened out.
That is great. Oh,
So
thanks.
that was just recently.
And thanks to Nate for noticing it in the first place. Nat, I mean.
Some of you are also familiar with the McKnight Prairie, which is 8 miles out of town. That was acquired with the help of Paul Jensen, my ecology faculty member. And still a very important place for students to visit and see what original prairie looks like. And also very important for the Arboretum as part of our restoration work, because we collect seed from McKnight Prairie to use in our plantings in the Arboretum.
That's great. And Chris has just put the link to the McKnight Prairie into the chat as well, folks. So if you want to check that out, please do.
So, Christopher, I'm sure people might be wondering what that big building is over there. That's the sewage treatment plant, which is very important in part of the work to increase the quality of the Cannon River. And what many of you might not know is that the Carleton used to own that property and transferred it to the city when they were looking for a place to build the sewage treatment plant. So while we, of course, don't want to lose land mass, that's important to the Arboretum, having a functional sewage treatment plant was very important.
Yeah.
That was in, gosh, it might have been in the 70s? Can't quite remember. One of my favorite trees because it's so big and majestic. This is a black willow.
Yeah, it's pretty delightful. As we walk, Nancy, how many acres total does the Arb comprise?
800 acres.
And that includes the upper Arb as well as the
Yes,
lower Arb.
upper and lower. I will have to tell you, it used to say on our website that it was 880. And when we changed it, a lot of people got worried that we had actually sold some land. We just got better at measuring. If you could train your camera across the river at that wooded slope, there was a question about the oak opening restoration project, and that's where that project has been taking on, been working. It's a slow process, even though it started in the late 80s. A lot of work removing undesirable trees and shrubs and to make it a more open habitat. But I would say we're very slowly getting there.
Is an oak opening the same as an oak savanna?
Yes, yes. Oak savanna is the broader term, and oak opening refers to more black soil type savanna.
While we're walking, maybe you could just fill us in on what is presumably one of the more famous aspects of the Arb, the Hill of Three Oaks.
Yeah, it's kind of the Hill of 2.5 Oaks right now.
Well, it's creative accounting, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, well, it's still there. It's still very much beloved and used for lots of social gatherings.
And what do you know, how old are the trees?
Well, the two big ones that are remaining are probably in the 200 to 250 year range, I would say.
Really?
I love those oaks and the other bur oaks on campus and in the Arb. I think about sometimes the fact that passenger pigeons surely nested in them 200 years ago, 150 years ago.
Back when there were
When
passenger
there were
pigeons.
passenger pigeons.
Yeah. And like any good day in the Arb here, the weather changes from minute to minute. It's getting a little bluer in the sky. And the river is half frozen over, but there's a full channel clear in the middle. We're starting to go uphill a little bit here, Nancy, and in towards the oak area. Remind us, are we halfway between campus and the Iron Bridge? How far along are we in the?
We are only about 20% of the way along.
That is a great sign of how big the Arb is.
If we were skiing or running, we could get there in about 20 minutes.
Well, we'll just walk instead.
Okay. So now we're going up what is now called Hillside Prairie. And this is very close to the first prairie restoration in the Arboretum that was started by students in the late 70s. As a very small project, they were very excited when the college agreed to give them a few acres of land to play around with. And now, of course, that has expanded to a much larger project. So, Chris, you should watch out. If there's any skiers coming down this hill, you better jump out of the way.
They're going to be going pretty fast.
Yeah.
Nancy, what time do you have on your watch?
I have 2:54.
Well, we've got about another 5-6 minutes here.
I think we'll get to the top of the hill where they can see the expanse of prairie. That's my target before the end of the hour.
That is a noble goal.
I wanted to mention that we have several faculty members who do their research in the Arboretum on the prairies. From the biology department, Mark McCone and Dan Hernandez, and they're interested in a lot of different aspects of prairies, but in particular how restored prairies change over time and the composition of the plants and what groups of plants are winners, as Mark will say, in terms of how many species you might find in a square meter. Dan is very interested in ecosystem functions and looking at carbon and nitrogen cycling, how carbon is captured in the soil by prairie roots. most summers they will have a team of 4 to 6 students working with them to help collect data out here in the prairie.
And now that we've gotten up towards the top of the hill, the wind has really picked up as well.
This is why I was keeping you down in the forest.
Thanks, Nancy.
Oh, this will be a great panoramic to end our day. We can see the water tower, of course, ahead of us, the chapel in the distance, one of those beautiful burrows to the right, Christopher. If you want to pan left, the 2 Carleton wind turbines, one more distant than the other. And then the large expanse of prairie that we've been building here.
So remind us what's been happening over the last 100 years or so with this particular bit of the prairie.
Sure. Well, 100 years ago, this would have all been in agriculture of some type. Carleton, of course, once they acquired this land under the direction of Donald Cowling when he was the president, Cowling purchased land around the college to make sure we would also always have beautiful surroundings. He didn't want to have to worry about what other landowners might do around us. But it stayed in farmland for a long time, either farmed by Carleton or rented out to area farmers. And then it wasn't until the 70s when efforts led by Ed Buchwald started to encourage conservation techniques in farming and eventual removal of some of the land that was more erosion prone or next to the river, removing that from farming, and then really accelerated with the hiring of a full-time arboretum manager in Miles Bakke in the late 80s, maybe 1990, and directed by Mark McCone, who was the ARB director then and helped sort out what type of goals we should have for restoration here. And so since then, there's been a real push for restoring all of the Arboretum land to some type of natural habitat.
That's really great. It is. It's an ongoing and complicated story.
Yes.
For sure. Yeah. We've had a lot of people on the call here who have not been back to the ARB or to campus for decades. Is the ARB open to everyone to come back now if they wish, even in the middle of a pandemic?
Yes, so the college, very wisely in my mind, made the decision early on that the Arboretum would stay open to all users, so public and from the campus community. And so we've had lots of visitors, all who've been very respectful of each other and not, crowding too close on trails and so forth. So we have been open and lots of people have been enjoying being out in nature.
And it being Minnesota in the winter, people would find it all the easier to mask up anyway.
Yes, exactly.
Good.
My mask feels really comfortable today.
Absolutely. So does mine. Well, folks, thanks so much for tuning in today to Carleton Connects. I've been really pleased to be able to walk around the ARB here in the winter with Nancy Breaker. And I'm glad for all the questions that you were able to send in and that we could get to. Please tune in the months to come for our upcoming shows. And as always, if you have questions or comments, please get in touch with me, Christopher Brunell, in the Office of Alumni Relations. Thanks very much, Nancy.
Hey, so glad to be out here.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.